All right, so a lot of people asked me about this, and I saw very, very funny comments on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it. And that's in regards to the new driving bill that we have here in Massachusetts. It's number S2246. And people asked my opinion, so I'm going to give it. I think that what this does is the government is going to try to dictate how far you could drive, how far you could commute, where you could commute to, and probably even where you could choose to live. Let's just call it what it is, right? I spent the last few days looking at this bill, and in my opinion, this isn't just about reducing emissions. It's about control, right? That's what this is. They keep on restricting us. And today, as requested, I'm going to break it down here for you. So here's how it goes. This bill is an act aligning the Commonwealth's transportation plans with some levels of mandates and goals for reducing emissions and these vehicle miles traveled. One thing, let's be fair for a second here, okay? I think that one thing that we could all agree on is that we would want cleaner air. We would want cleaner water. We want to protect the environment, all of these things. But if these come at a cost that people can't afford, it's a problem, right? It's a problem. And that is the problem. So when you dig deeper, of course, what you're going to find within this bill itself is a web of ridiculous and costly mandates, questionable effectiveness, and I think a clear infringement on personal freedom. Again, this is my opinion. So let's talk about this. This bill should be opposed by anybody that likes freedom. If you are here and you don't like freedom, you're basically in the wrong space, right? So first, let's start with actually how this bill is constructed and what it mandates. And it mandates that Massachusetts transportation planning, including both local and regional, they have to align with the state's target for reducing greenhouse gas. And also some levels of reducing emissions and vehicle miles traveled. So in other words, it's not enough for people to go out and get electric vehicles. They couldn't impose that on people. They can't enforce that on people. So now they're basically trying to do this instead, right? That's basically what this is. At least that's what I think this is. So I think that the government clearly wants you driving less, right? I think that's pretty clear. And this introduces a system where every transportation project must pass an emissions impact and a vehicle miles traveled test. But here's the thing. Metropolitan planning organizations, they cannot approve transportation plans unless they show what they're calling a reasonable pathway to meet emissions and VMT goals. That's vehicle miles traveled. So the bill tries to prioritize transit expansion, micro-mobility infrastructure, parking restrictions, and land use changes, which seems to be designed to discourage you from, guess what? Using the car that you own. And really, when you think about it, what this does, it hands these unelected bureaucrats the power to define and enforce vehicle miles traveled reduction targets, not just for 2030, but it also allows them to try to mandate these things out to 2050, which, as you know, is our state's so-called net carbon or net zero carbon, net carbon zero goals, however they want to pronounce it or phrase it or pretty it up, right? But these mandates, they are shaping up to be, I mean, when you think about it, the more mandates we have, this net zero carbon thing looks more like net zero income. At least that seems to be the goal for working class families, because that's what it's doing. It's taking money from our pockets to fund their progressive ideas. So, in short, this is about less freedom to drive and more top-down planning. So let's talk about the cost a little bit here. The bill is, I would say, quite ambitious and quite progressive, right? But what happens is the more ambitious and the more progressive these things are, guess what? The costs go up, right? That's what happens. So let's consider what's required to meet the mandates. When you look at expanding public transportation, this is a notoriously expensive and often underused item. People are not driving into work. A lot of people are still working from home, right? And for example, the MBTA is already facing upwards of like $8 or $9 billion in unfunded maintenance needs. And now they want to expand this further. But meanwhile, the public transportation needs all these repairs. What are we going to have? More bike lanes, more micro mobility infrastructure, and more transit-oriented developments, right? I mean, think about it. The state is in a position where they're not spending money on repairing things. They're trying to fix things until they're broken. That's basically what this is. And the funding assessment studies and these layers of bureaucracy to try to enforce compliance, I think will add to that already large burden, that already large budget burden, right? Think about it. Who's going to pay for this shit? You and I. That's who's most likely going to pay for it. I looked at a study from 2022 from the Pioneer Institute, and they said that Massachusetts transportation, they're already spending upwards of $9 billion annually. And I think what's going to happen here is this bill is going to add new and more mandates without providing any clear funding resources or goals, right? Think about what happened with the MBTA Communities Act. That's almost like an unfunded mandate. Now these communities have to scramble to try to put together the funds in order to get done what they want to get done, right? We'll see higher fees. They're going to divert funds from other more projects that they should prioritize. That's what'll happen here. And look, maybe this sounds, I was thinking about this from a business perspective, right? Because I am a business owner. So, and maybe this is unfair for me to say this, but this is the way I'm looking at this. If the state starts aggressively enforcing, let's say, these VMT reduction targets, I think there could be real restrictions and real consequences on how freely businesses could operate. And here's a really good example. Picture a manufacturer or a logistics company out in Western Massachusetts, far west Massachusetts, right? If their trucks and their truck drivers face any new limitations, or if the cost of driving goes up because of, let's say, parking restrictions or road use fees, or even some levels of fuel mandates, what's going to happen is suddenly their ability to move goods or products from point A to point B is going to be compromised, or it's going to cost significantly more, whether it's time and or money. And the same could be said for the employees of these businesses, because if people working in suburbs or, far out like Western Massachusetts, if they have a harder time commuting, because public transit doesn't reach them, what happens is this will ultimately shrink the available labor pool. And I know I'm just speculating here, but hear me out. Another good one is like, imagine if customers can't or won't travel as easily to retail locations or service providers even, the sales could take a hit because of this. It's really just basic economics, guys. The less freedom of movement means the potential higher costs, reduced competitiveness, especially for industries located outside of Boston where transit options are limited, right? They're limited there. And here's the next critical question that I have for you guys, actually. Let's do it like this. I'm reading these things, and I've said this before. I look at these things, and I just cannot believe I'm reading. So do you think this is actually going to work? Because I don't. You could let me know in the comments. I do not see how this is possibly going to work. I really don't see how it's possible. So thinking along those lines led me to look at other states. I always like to look for proof of concept, right? So if this worked in another state, now it's never a 1-for-1, right? That never happens, but I like to know. So, of course, California, who we seem to be trading bad ideas with, they passed this similar bill. I can't remember. It was like SB3, I think it was SB 375. And I believe it was back in like 07 or 08 they did this. And that bill required metropolitan areas to align transportation and land use with greenhouse gas goals or greenhouse gas targets, whatever their targets are. And according to the California Air Resource Board, within their own reporting, this was a self-report, 2023, vehicle miles traveled in California increased, not decreased. The report even bluntly stated that progress is not on track. So when I look at these things, I think, why? And I believe it's because forcing people to drive less through planning mandates doesn't account for the realities of modern life. Essentially, what looks good on paper doesn't always look good or end up being good in practice, right? There's other failed policies out there too. Oregon was another one that tried to implement some kind of vehicle miles traveled tax. And it was like a pilot program or something. And they aimed at reducing driving and funding road maintenance. That's what their plan was. And the program ended up facing a ton of public backlash. And guess what? It was largely ineffective. You want to know why it was ineffective? Because people aren't stupid. And people that are driving, they simply found workarounds. Seattle, they also did this. They pushed for zero emission zones, and the urban mobility plans ended up hurting small businesses as the reduction in cars and traffic led to lesser foot traffic. And guess what happened? That means that the businesses had fewer sales. And then I think this is the last one, the least that I can remember. Back in 2021, the Seattle Times, there was an analysis that the Seattle Times did, and they found that most of the businesses reported declining revenue after the restrictions. And as mentioned earlier, California's VMT mandates failed to deliver meaningful emission reductions despite massive spending. So when you look at these things, right, the common thread is that the central when you do these levels of central planning, it doesn't work when it comes to how people live and how they move. And again, when you're looking at other states for proof of concept, you got to say to yourself, okay, this failed here, this failed here, this failed here. Now we're going to be overly ambitious and try to get it to work here. It just doesn't make sense. And these top-down mandates, they end up failing because they ignore the needs of families, they ignore the needs of individuals and businesses. You know, people drive because they need to, not because they want to, but also they sometimes drive because they want to and not because they need to. It's very, very simple, but also very, very complicated at the same exact time. And I think that Massachusetts could face the same exact problems that these other states or towns or cities have faced, because outside of the greater Boston area, public transit is really limited or non-existent. Or to put it simply, it's not efficient. And when you're trying to coerce people out of using their cars that they purchase through policy mandates, it's not a good look overall. No one wants to be forced to do something, which leads me to talk about my greatest concern in this entire video, and that is the continued attack on personal freedom here. This bill doesn't just encourage cleaner transportation, as I said earlier. I think that it aims to reshape how you live your damn life. This is a problem, and it affects everybody. It really does. Where you live by promoting dense, transit-oriented housing and you're also discouraging further suburban development. It affects how you get to work by penalizing drivers and forcing more reliance on public transit or potentially biking. And it affects, let's say, when and how much you drive through VMT restrictions and the indirect pressure of an additional cost, because we don't even know what the hell it's going to be. And really, these changes won't be voluntary, right? And what this does is it empowers these unelected bureaucrats to set binding VMT reduction targets for every single decade, and these agencies will be required to potentially enforce them on us. That's a problem. Think about it. Unelected officials controlling how far you can drive, maybe even what you could drive, Is that really what the residents of Massachusetts want? Look, I'll tell it like it is, right? If they want help writing these bills, I'll volunteer. I'll do it for free because it's really not that complicated. It's actually quite simple. Guess what? You start with the end in mind. How will this affect the people that are living ordinary lives, right? How will this impact families? How will this impact workers? And how will this impact small businesses just trying to get by? That's it. But instead, we get this top-down mandate approach that ignores the basic question every public policy should ask, and that is this: how will this make life better for the people that we serve? In my opinion, that is not doing it. That is not doing it. This is making the ideological goals of some people happy. That's all that this is, in my opinion. And again, I'm all for, look, I go hiking. I used to go mountain biking. I go to the ocean. I bring my kids there all the time. I also am considerate of potentially saving the planet. However, if it comes at a cost that's creating this unsustainable environment, you need to tone things down a little bit, right? You need to tone things down a little bit. And you need to write policies that not some people agree with, but that everybody agrees with, not just a select few or whomever your political donors are that you're beholden to, right? That's the problem. Start with what the people want and work backwards. Start from there. Is that too much to ask, right? Is that too much to ask? I don't think that it is. Anyway, that's all I got for this. That's it. That's it for today's video. Bye-bye.